All right, welcome to the Cwic Media Come Follow Me series. In this episode, we are covering the Book of Esther. Now, a couple things here setting the stage for this book. Number one, it is the last of the 24 canonical Jewish books in the Tanakh, right? It's the last one that was ever canonized. There's kind of a reason for that. One of them is that it's not a theological text. Right? There is not a single mention of God or the Lord in this entire book, which is very odd, right? It's much more of a text that is used more as a kind of a nationalistic kind of a text for the Jewish people, because they are this is it saves them from genocide. Esther ends up saving the Jews in the Persian Empire from genocide. It is the Jews over the Persians, so to speak. So it's set up in a way that is much more of a story about courage. And even then, it's not a courage in the Lord. At least that's not the way it's told. It's more of a courage for the people. And so keep that in mind as we go through this. And let's take lessons from the story that we get. That even though there aren't any specific theological lessons, maybe that, at least not directly, that we can draw from this. It is a very interesting book. A couple of things, let's go right into the text here in chapter 1. We're going to see the summary here that says, Ahasuerus of Persia and Media makes royal feasts. This whole book is about royal feasts. It's feasts galore. It's just over and over again, or banquets as they call them. It's very much about feasts. And this is the book that is used for a Jewish feast called Purim, right? Which is something that where each year as they go through Purim, they're going to read the Book of Esther during that time. It's about the deliverance of the Jewish people under Persian rule. And so it's very apropos that there are a number of feasts that are depicted in this story. Now, in verse 1 here, now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this is Ahasuerus which reigned from India, even unto Ethiopia, over 127 provinces, so 127 provinces. The Persian Empire is the largest empire at this time. That in those days when the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, or Shusha, the palace. In the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all his princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces being before him. So he's got who knows how many, maybe up to 127, or many of these princes and representatives from these different countries that are there. And it's like, hey, this is a massive feast for the Persian Empire. You're going to participate in this. This is a time of celebration, probably a depiction from Ahasuerus of his wealth and his power over these provinces. So he goes out here and he has a feast that's going to last 180 days, 6 months, right? Big time feast. And when he's done with this, he goes on and he has another 7-day feast. Now, this 7-day feast we need to look at closely because this is where we get the story of Vashti, his queen, his wife. And one thing that's interesting about this is that according to Jewish tradition and going to the Midrash, what you have here is a week feast, right? A feast for the week that is started at the beginning of the week and ends on the Sabbath. And so what happens here with Vashti happens on the Sabbath. I think that's important to know because for Jewish tradition, right, this is going to be a very important day. The Jews typically should be, they would be resting, they would be reading from Scripture, they would be worshiping Jehovah, and yet what they're possibly doing here is participating maybe as servants to Ahasuerus and his guests here at the feast. Now, during this time of this 7-day feast, it says, also Vashti, the queen made a feast for the women in the royal house which belonged to King Ahasuerus. So she has her own feast for the women, which means that the other feast is for the men. And on the seventh day, this would be Shabbat, according to Jewish legend or Jewish tradition, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Bitha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abaktha, Sethar, and Carcass, the 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, to bring Vashti, the queen, before the king with the crown royal, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on. So there are some things we should know about this, and you know, I rarely ever have seen other Come Follow Me series, you know, online. I've seen a few minutes here and there of a few of them. There's a couple I know just from those few minutes that I really like. Some I probably don't. Well, some I don't. And but this week, I happened to see one that came up on my YouTube timeline that I watched that was something I've never said this before, and I'm not going to specifically call anybody out, but you need to be careful online with the Come Follow Me series, and I'm including my own on this, right? I'm including my own Come Follow Me series. Take things with a grain of salt sometimes, and understand that everybody talks about these things with their own worldview, what they've learned. Oftentimes they're just regurgitating what they've learned. Most of the time, these are not original thoughts. That doesn't mean that's bad. It just means they're carrying on a narrative. And then most importantly, understand that biblical scholarship is part of academia. And so even within the church, your environment of biblical scholarship is very much given a specific narrative of the religion, what I call the religion of academia, which is an identitarian view of things. And so in this specific Come Follow Me video that I watched, it's only about 9 or 10 minutes long. I don't know where the sister is from. She's a member of the church. She's probably a professor. I don't know if she's at BYU, but you know, she takes on what would come out of a specific type of reading, an identitarian reading of Vashti. Vashti, the queen here, in feminist theology, is an icon, a hero. And therefore, there's a specific narrative as to how she is viewed. Even though there's no proof of this, there's no evidence that would give a specific outlook about Vashti, right? It's not by itself anyway. There are things you can go to the Midrash and the Talmud and other oral histories and see some things and bring some things out, which is what this sister does. But she talks about Vashti as a kind of a feminist icon here. And if you go back to verse 11 here, and you see it says, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with a crown royal, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on. So in the Midrash, there, which is a exegesis of which is a interpretation of scripture and tradition that the rabbis give us, and in the Midrash here, they have that Vashti the queen, what King Ahasuerus wanted was to bring the queen. When it says bring the queen before the king with the crown royal, that it was only the crown. In other words, she was with nothing else on, right? And that her beauty would be seen as a naked body with the crown on in front of the men, right? And that Vashti did not want to do this. And so it's given in a sense, and this is just, it's not just specific to this issue here. I'm just saying, when you look at biblical scholarship, it's always there's going to be a strong element of identitarianism. So whether it's feminism, sexual orientation, patriarchy, there's going to be a view on these things, kind of like taking our culture and trying to put it on top as a filter over Scripture. And that's what I saw in that video completely. Because in the Midrash, it is shown, it does say that this is what happened, but there are other renditions of this as well, right? Other renditions of how this might have happened. And even then, you don't know that it's true. Any of them are true. I mean, one of them has her having the angel Gabriel come with a magical, call it a curse, and giving her a tail. So you know, the idea that she came out and was supposed to come out naked in front of all the men, you know, one of the other options in there is that she was supposed to have a tail given to her, and that's why she couldn't come out. That's why she wouldn't come out. A third one is that she had leprosy. She had a sudden bout of leprosy, and she didn't want to come out because she was a leper at the time. But what concerns me the most is just just look for that, right? You look for the identitarianism in biblical scholarship, even in the church, because it is everywhere in academia, and it's in biblical scholarship, and it's in LDS scholarship. And so just take that with a grain of salt. That video then goes on and takes the whole idea of Vashti here. In fact, the title of it is something that may not even be true, but it is Vashti refuses to undress for the king. That's the title. Okay, that is a massive assumption. We have no idea if that's true whatsoever. And if you go even further into the Midrash and other oral tradition there with the rabbis, you'll see that actually the Babylonian rabbis especially, they have a very bad view of Vashti, right? That she was perhaps the daughter of the previous king of Babylon, and that's why she's married to Ahasuerus, because she has royal Babylonian blood, and now as Persia takes over Babylon, she's going to be married into the family and create kind of an allyship there, and that she's a temptress and an adulteress and evil, right? Because she comes from the line of Nebuchadnezzar, who brought the Jews into captivity into Babylon. And then on the other side of that, they also have Ahasuerus as an usurper, right? As a dominant usurper and an evil man. It looks to me more like they confuse him with a different Xerxes or Ahasuerus that came about earlier. But these are huge assumptions to make about Vashti and even Ahasuerus. We don't know anything about them. We just don't know. Was Ahasuerus a party animal because he put in all these feasts? How often does the largest empire in the world put together massive feasts? I don't know. Maybe that happens all the time. Was he trying to parade his wife, the queen, out in front of all of the men in a way to humiliate her because they had a problem with their marriage? I don't know. Did she righteously refuse to do this because he wanted to humiliate her and she was a proper and good person? We don't know. We have no idea. So to create an entire narrative around this and actually make the title of something in the name of feminism it's very telling, is all I'm saying, as to how we need to be careful. And I include myself in here also, right? We need to be careful even when looking at certain sources that you think might be strong and safe. They're not. I promise you, not all of those sources are safe. Okay. So Vashti says no. She defies the king. And by the way, anyone in ancient time in the Middle East and anywhere in the world at this time that defies the king in anything, there's going to be a major problem, right? There will be a major problem. And that doesn't go just for the kings. Look at Elizabeth I. Look at Evita. Look at Cleopatra, right? It doesn't matter who it is. Power is a very dangerous thing. and whether it's patriarchal or matriarchal, right? The whole idea that about kings in the Book of Mormon and in the Old Testament is that you have to be careful about royalty, because they're not the King of Kings. None of them are perfect like God, and God even says this, right? When Saul is going to be placed in as king, because the people want a king. And they're like, look, they want a king, fine. Which actually says to Jehovah, he says something to the effect of, they don't want me as their king. And so it's not just a patriarchal issue. And again, I'm going to bring up that video. She actually takes this idea of Vashti and moves it over into priesthood and how men might abuse the priesthood. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but what an odd thing to bring out. In terms of, this is not a person with a priesthood. It has nothing to do with a person with a priesthood. It's a very odd thing to go through, and a very odd, but unfortunately growing lens of identitarianism that Biblical Scholarship and LDS Scholarship is beginning to use to view the Scriptures. We're going to see, unfortunately, a lot more of this as we move forward. All right, so then what happens? Vashti is perhaps exiled, maybe even killed. We don't know. And that leaves an opening for Esther, the Jewess, to come in and become the queen. So Mordecai, her cousin or uncle, is the one who presents her to Ahasuerus. She's one of many that are presented to the king, and he is going to choose who is going to be the new queen. Now here in verse 7 we see, and he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter. Okay, so she was adopted by Mordecai here. So her name originally is Hadassah. You see in the name Esther here something interesting. It has something to do with royalty, because it's very similar to the goddesses of the ancient Near East, right? So you have, for example, Asherah. You have Ashratah. You have in Persia Ishtar. You have Astarte, right? So these are all names, very similar names with variations of really the same thing that you have in the ancient Near East. And so she has a name like that. And so you would couple deities with royalty, and those would go together very much so. So all these women are presented to the king. He decides here in verse 17, and the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Now, this is an interesting thing here, because what you're going to see throughout the book of Esther is this constant replacement, or almost an ironic telling of the story, where one person acts in some ways as a proxy for another, or there's a juxtaposition of two individuals or two ideas that end up crossing and changing places. So here you have, of course, Esther, who is put in place or instead of Vashti. So we'll look for that here further in the text. Now, importantly, down a little bit further here in verse 21, in those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth and sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. So there is a plot to kill the king by a couple of his chamberlains. So Mordecai finds out about this. This is important for later in the story. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther, the queen, and Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. So the two chamberlains are hanged, maybe crucified even, but they're hanged. And then we move into the story with a new character called Haman, or Haman, as we usually call it. So Haman is an interesting character. And you've heard me talk about the Amalekites that we get in the Old Testament, and they are this this almost like this perennial foe, that this constant foe that the Israelites are faced with, and that they get right at the beginning when they leave Egypt. In the Exodus, there's the Amalekites waiting for them to ambush them, and that's where they have their first battle, where Joshua leads them in the battle, and where you have Moses raising his hands and we might call them counselors that are holding up his hands, and as long as they hold his hands up, then the battle goes their way and they defeat the Amalekites. Well, the Amalekites are always around, right? It's an Amalekite is the one who killed King Saul, and they're mentioned many, many times. And if we follow that legacy again, I think that we can pull that over into the legacy and the names that we see in the Book of Mormon. Haman here is also by many Jews called an Amalekite, or Amalek himself. Why would that be? Because Haman is looking to destroy all of the Jews. And that was the mission of the Amalekites. And that's why the Lord in the Old Testament gives that decree to the Israelites to kill all of the Amalekites. All right? And now you may say that's specific to the tribe, or it might be all those that seek to destroy the house of Israel. Okay, so Haman is one of these characters. He's going to be the one who initiates what he believes is going to be a genocide of the Jews under Persian rule. So the king takes Haman and sets his seat above all the princes that were with him. So he's above everybody. He's kind of like the viceroy. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. And we learned this is for whatever reason, because he is Jewish. Then the king's servants which were in the king's gate said unto Mordecai, Why transgressest thou the king's commandment? Now it came to pass when they spake daily unto him, and he hearkened not unto them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand. For he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath. So what do we get here in this telling here? What you get here is, I believe, something very similar to the idea of Lehi's dream, with the great and spacious building, which is pride, lifting yourself up, and the other is abasing yourself and being later exalted, right? So the great and spacious building is you lift yourself up, but you're going to fall, because pride comes before the fall, right? And the other side is the tree of life, which is the doctrine of Christ that I don't think we focus on enough. In my belief, this is my estimation, these are Greg's words, that the tree of life represents the doctrine of Christ, a big part of which is the condescension of God, lowering yourself below all things so that you are exalted by God. God is the one that exalts you. The opposite of the great and spacious building. That's what we're going to have here with Mordecai and Haman, are these two things. One full of pride who's going to fall, one who abases himself who is going to be exalted. Right? Again, there's that juxtaposition that is going to happen here. And so in verse 6, and he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had showed him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. So he is furious about this. Perhaps there is something about the Jewish tradition here where they're not going to bow to someone else unless maybe it's the king himself. Regardless of what it is, Haman here is now willing to slaughter all of the Jews. So Haman goes to the king here in verse 8, and he says there is a certain people scattered abroad. Remember, there's a lot of different peoples here under the Persian Empire, and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of the kingdom. And their laws are diverse from all people. Neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore, it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. Okay, so they're a distinct and a peculiar people. This is important to see, because this is what happens with the Jews wherever they go. They are a distinct people. They have, how many people? There aren't a lot, right, that keep the same traditions for 3,000 or 4,000 years. And even when they're scattered, there is a network of them and they have the same beliefs. And in many cases, whether they're in Persia or Babylon or Europe or US or wherever it is, right? They are a distinct people with distinct traditions and beliefs. And they are in many ways strangers in a strange land. And so where you get other disbursements of people, even with the 10 tribes, right? You have an assimilation into the peoples and into the cultures more than not of those people, right? They assimilate into these cultures, but the Jews do not, which is pretty impressive, right? They keep the Passover still that they kept at the time of the Exodus. There's just specific traditions that it's very impressive, that they have done this. And so this is kind of the way it is here. Even though this is probably, early 5th century BC, probably when this happens, this is probably about, let's just throw a guess out there, 60, 70 years after the time that Ezra and of the Jews, a portion of the Jews going back to Jerusalem from the captivity in Babylon. Some people think it's before that, but most, I think, still think it's probably early to mid part of the 5th century BC. So very impressive with the way that the Jews have held together as a people. So Haman says to the king, look, if it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business to bring it unto the king's treasures. We see oftentimes pieces of silver being used for betrayal. And so the king took his ring from his hand and gave it unto Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. Again, he's still today looked at as, you've got Purim here, where this book is read every year. And so, he is a major foe, a major enemy to the Jewish people. So here in chapter 4 then, in Esther, you have Mordecai finding this out, right? Verse 1, when Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes and went out into the midst of the city and cried with a loud and a bitter cry, and came even before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews. What are we going to do? And fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So this is obviously very troublesome to all of the Jews as they find this out. There's a day that is set where they are all going to perish. And by the way, this payment that would be destroying the Jews, this is something that doesn't just happen here. This happened in Europe. There would be motivation for going out under Nazi rule, for example, where the Nazis would go out and actually turn the people that they controlled under their empire, right? So whether it's Austria or Poland or other places, where they would turn the people on the Jews. And the way that they would do that is that they would put out a decree saying that there might not be direct payment all the time, but you get to keep whatever possessions the Jews have. So if you go in and you discover a Jewish family, you can kick them out of their home, you can turn them in, and you get to keep all of their possessions. So in a time of war, especially, that's a big deal. So this is common practice. So Mordecai discovers this. He gets message to Esther, and so Esther decides she's going to need to go in to the king and talk to him. Now, she hasn't been in for quite some time. And here's the problem. Think about what happened to Vashti. We don't know how severe that was, but exile or death, probably, one of those two. So she's going to go in at the peril of her own life to speak to the king, because you don't go in to speak to the king without being summoned. And again, this is not just patriarchal. If it was the queen that was in charge, it would be the exact same thing, right, of any man to go in to speak to the queen, if you go in and speak to Cleopatra, or you go in and speak to, Elizabeth, anciently, or Elizabeth I, then you're in big trouble, right? You can't just go in and do that. So here in verse 11, all the king's servants and all the peoples of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. Okay, so she hasn't been in to even speak with him for 30 days. And notice she was called to come into him 30 days ago. So they told Mordecai Esther's words, and Mordecai said to Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall there enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? This is one of the only references that you can kind of make an indirect assumption of the Lord's hand in this, right? So, and who knoweth whether thou art, being Esther, thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And that to me is the best part of this whole story, because we all fit into that category, right? In anything. And so who knows that you aren't sent to the family you're in for a specific reason, or to the ward that you're in, or to the job that you're in, or as a parent to the kids that you have, right? Or in any situation, or a situation where you can stand up for the gospel. Maybe you were put in that place to see if you would stand up to support the gospel of Jesus Christ, to support the church, right? So were you put in and come to the kingdom for such a time as this? It puts into perspective the idea of the Lord's timing. How involved is the Lord in directing the events of your life? Is he super involved? Does a certain situation arise so that you can be tested? Is there the Lord's timing? It's a big question when it comes to things like doctrine and policy in the church and other things. You think about the revelation on the priesthood. Was it just Brigham Young who decided this? Was there inspiration with that? Was there the Lord's timing? Or was it just racist? Well, if there's no Lord's timing there, is there Lord's timing in 1978? I think most people would think so. And if 1978 came about, why didn't it happen earlier? How is the Lord, does the Lord's timing work with all of these things? How does it work in your own life? So then Esther sends a message at this point to Mordecai to have all of the Jews fast for 3 days. This includes drink, right? No food and no drink for 3 days. That's about as far as you can go without real danger. And I also and my maidens will fast likewise. And so then in chapter 5, Esther is going to go in unto the king here. So it says here in verse 1, now it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house over against the gate of the house. And it was so, when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter. She's saved, right? That was in his hand. Now, here's the question, right? This is the same thought that we get about, Daniel or Abinadi, right? That in a sense, using the words here about, the golden scepter being used, it wasn't used for Abinadi. So he went in regardless, knowing that he was probably going to die. I think he knew he was going to die. And he said things anyway. Right? So it's not, the lesson here, I don't think, is that look what can happen if you have courage. You're going to be blessed and everything's going to work out. Right? Daniel, it does work out. Right? He goes into the lion's den and it works out. But that doesn't always happen. In fact, I would say most of the time it doesn't. The test is, are you going to do what you're supposed to do? The test is of your faith. It's not of the blessing. The test is of who you're going to become and the decisions that you're going to make, and are you going to master your agency properly? So we get a favorable outcome here with Esther, but she may not have gotten that favorable outcome. And it still would have been the right thing to do. So then the king said unto her, what wilt thou, Queen Esther, and what is thy request? It shall be given thee to the half of the kingdom. And Esther answered, if it seem good unto the king, let the king and Haman come this day unto the banquet, another festival, another feast, that I have prepared for him. Then the king said, cause Haman to make haste, that he may do as Esther hath said. All right, so the king agrees, and Haman and the king are going to go to this banquet. Now, Haman goes forth that day joyful and with a glad heart, but when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up, nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordecai. So we get another telling of that oppressive power, so to speak, from Haman over Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman refrained himself, and when he came home, he sent and called for his friends and Zeresh his wife. And then we get this pride, a little more about the pride of Haman here. It says, and Haman told them of the glory of his riches and the multitude of his children, and all the things wherein the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the princes and servants of the king. Right? So he's being elevated here in the text, and by himself. And Haman said, moreover, yea, Esther the queen did let no man come in with the king unto the banquet that she had prepared, but myself. So this is a very special thing, he's thinking. And tomorrow am I invited unto her also with the king. But he's very unhappy about Mordecai. So he says here in the last verse, 14 of chapter 5, then said Zeresh his wife and all his friends unto him, let a gallows be made of 50 cubits high. That is really, really tall. That's for everybody to see from far away, I guess. And tomorrow speak thou unto the king, that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. Then go thou in merrily with the king unto the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. So Haman creates the gallows, has the gallows to be made, and he in his mind, and this is the juxtaposition, the irony, the proxy kind of rule here that kind of works out here. He says he's going to go to the banquet, and he's going to speak to the king of the banquet and have Mordecai hanged on the gallows. And then we get another story of this irony and juxtaposition here. On that night could not the king sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. So he may not know about this, and or at least doesn't remember about it, and yet Mordecai has never said anything to him apparently about like, hey, why didn't I get rewarded for this? And this is again the idea of his condescension, of his humility, so to speak. And the king said, what honor and dignity hath been done to Mordecai for this? And the servants said unto him, nothing's been done for him. And so the king said, who's in the court right now? And they said, well, Haman's in the court. And so he talks to Haman about this, and he says, hypothetically, what shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, to whom would the king delight to do honor more than to myself? And Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delighteth to honor. And he says, let the royal apparel be brought, which the king useth to wear, and the horse that the king rideth upon, and the crown royal which is set upon his head. So this would be a common thing back then, as you're going to dress someone up as the king and give him the praise of this among the people. And in some cases, this is done as a mocking ritual also. This was done in a mocking ritual as well. And so then it says, and let this apparel and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man withal whom the king delighteth to honor, and bring him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. And so the king says to Haman, okay, great, that sounds fabulous. Make haste, and take the apparel of the horse, as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew. Wow. Okay, so this is, what's he going to do now? He wants him hanged on the gallows. And here the king is going to have him praised, according to the words of Haman. Irony. So Haman takes the apparel and the horse and arrayed Mordecai. So again, what is he doing? He's raising up Mordecai instead of lowering him by bringing the horse and the apparel to Mordecai and putting it on him. And brought him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaimed before him, thus shall it be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor. Now, think about this for a minute. That there is some context to this. This is a ritual. This is a tradition. And like I said before, sometimes it's done in a mocking manner. Who else was arrayed in royal robes and had a crown placed on them, and rode in on not a horse, but a donkey into the east gate of the walls of Jerusalem, and had people shouting for him, right? Hoshana, 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 which is a royal decree. It's a royal thing, right? It's used in the same idea as God save us. Or God save the king, or God save the queen. But in this case, it's God save us. Hoshana is God save us, right? So that also is a royal procession, just like this is like a royal procession. So then here in chapter 7 here, they go to the banquet. There is Haman, there is the king, there is Esther. And the king said again unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, what is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed, even to the half of the kingdom. Then Esther the queen answered and said, if I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, and I and my people to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. Then the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, who is he, and where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so, to commit this genocide? And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. So this day has not worked out real well for Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. And the king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden, and Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. Then the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed whereon Esther was. Then said the king, will he force the queen also before me in the house? So he's in there actually asking for forgiveness is what he's actually doing. But as the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. And Harbona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. So again, you have this idea of proxy, you have this idea of irony, you have this idea of juxtaposition. It is the self-elevation and pride of the great and spacious building, which falls eventually. And the lowering yourself and abasing yourself and taking on the burdens of others and having the doctrine of Christ as your guiding light and humility, that is what actually will elevate you, that the Lord elevates you. You don't elevate yourself. That's happening. So we can actually see that great and spacious building in the tree of life. If you look at the tree of life that way, it's my opinion, not doctrine, right? But they're opposites in that sense. And that is an irony that you have in the dream of Lehi. So, in chapter 8 then, Mordecai is honored and placed over the house of Haman. So he actually rules in his stead, kind of, again, proxy in a sense. Ahasuerus issues a decree to preserve the Jews. And the way he does this, he can't get rid of the old one because that is sealed by his ring, a decree that was already put in place. What he says instead is there's a new decree, and here we get the juxtaposition and the irony again. All those who had planned on killing all of the Jews and were in place to do that throughout the empire are now killed instead of the Jews. And so again, more irony, and the story ends with that irony. And here we get again a story of deliverance for the Jews, and a story that's kind of a nationalistic or a tribal type of a story that is brought about through the courage of primarily a woman, and then there's Mordecai also. But primarily this is about Esther and her courage to go in unto the king, to risk her life, and to save her people. And so we see here, just from the summary of chapter 9, the Jews slay their enemies, including Haman's 10 sons. The Feast of Purim is instituted to commemorate their deliverance and victory. Mordecai, the Jew, stands next to Ahasuerus in power and might, just as Haman did, and he now is in his stead and in his place. So a book of irony, a book of juxtaposition, a book of proxy in many ways, a book that talks about courage, and that all of us can be like Esther in the sense of, even if we have to risk our lives, do we stand up for those that we love? Do we try and do the right thing? And even when it's not at the peril of our own lives, but maybe our name, maybe we're going to be shamed, do we submit to the spiral of silence, or do we speak up? And I think that's the message that Esther gives us. Thanks for listening.